Bonjour, il est 14h30, donc it is 2:30. So this is our International Perspectives Roundtable. Donc j'appelle au podium donc Monsieur Frank Rose, Nick WITNEY. Hello. Et Andrey BAKLITSKYI, qui vont nous faire partager un point de vue international sur le sujet. Alors nous allons commencer par le docteur Frank Rose, qui est chargé de recherche en matière de sécurité et de stratégie à la Brookings Institution. Il a été secrétaire, il a occupé différentes fonctions de responsabilité dans le contrôle des armements et la vérification au secrétaire d'État, au département d'État des États-Unis. Il a également occupé des postes au ministère de la Défense des États-Unis, au Congrès, dans le secteur privé. Et donc, je crois qu'il y a une expérience très très riche qui pourrait nous faire partager dans des domaines stratégiques. Donc, Dr. Frank Rose, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to join you here today in Paris. What I want to do for you today is provide you an American perspective on the future of deterrence and strategic stability. It won't necessarily be a Trump administration perspective, but a broader American perspective. In my presentation today, I'd like to accomplish two key objectives. First, I will discuss the changing nature of the global strategic environment and the impact of that changing environment on strategic stability. Second, I will discuss what specific actions I believe the United States, working in close coordination with its allies, should take in order to effectively respond to these challenges. So let me begin with my assessment of the evolving security environment. The 2018 U.S. Nuclear Posture Review, or NPR, states, and I quote, "The global threat conditions have worsened markedly since the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. The United States faces a, quote, more diverse and advanced nuclear threat environment than ever before. In particular, the Nuclear Posture Review highlights the return of great power competition. As my colleague at the Brookings Institution, Thomas Wright, notes in his recent book, All Measures Short of War, quote, the United States is in competition with Russia and China for the future of the international order. And this great power competition will likely be with us for the foreseeable future. Furthermore, strategic stability in the emerging security environment no longer follows the two-state, i.e. United States and Soviet, one-weapon, nuclear weapon model of the Cold War. Today's security environment includes multiple states and additional capabilities such as anti-satellite weapons and offensive cyber capabilities. This, I think, represents a broad assessment of the challenge, but let me go into a little bit more detail specifically with regards to the strategic challenge from Russia and China. Since the end of the Cold War in 1991, U.S. presidents of both parties have sought to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. defense strategy. However, the Russian national security establishment has not shared this view. As the U.S. National Intelligence Council noted in 2012, quote, Nuclear ambitions in the United States and Russia over the last 20 years have evolved in opposite directions. Reducing the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. security strategy is a U.S. objective, while Russia is pursuing new concepts and capabilities for expanding the role of nuclear weapons in its security strategy. I always like to remind people that Russia did not sign the New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, or other nuclear arms control agreements because it believed in a, quote, world without nuclear weapons. It does not. Rather, New START was fundamentally, for the Russians, about maintaining strategic nuclear parity with the United States, capping the number of deployed U.S. nuclear forces, and providing Russia insights into U.S. strategic forces that it would not have access to without the treaty. Russia has been modernizing its strategic forces for over a decade, which is allowed under the New START Treaty. Indeed, the U.S. Department of State's annual Arms Control Compliance Report notes that based on information available as of December 31st, 2017, the United States certifies that the Russian Federation is in compliance with the New START Treaty. That said, I think Russia's approach to non-strategic weapons, which Felipe Herrera talked about a little bit earlier this morning, is much more troubling. Of particular concern is Russia's development and deployment of a new ground-launched cruise missile, the SSC-8, or also known as the 9M729, which is a direct violation of its obligations under the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. After 5 years of diplomatic engagements beginning in 2013, under President Obama, and I was responsible for many of these engagements. Yesterday in Brussels, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the U.S. intention to withdraw from the treaty within 60 days if Russia fails to return to compliance. I would also note that Russia has been very irresponsible regarding its public rhetoric on nuclear weapons. There have been several occasions over the past several years when Russian officials have threatened to use nuclear weapons against U.S. allies. For example, in March 2015, the Russian ambassador to Denmark asserted that if Denmark allowed its Navy to participate in the NATO missile defense system, its warships would become, quote, targets of Russian nuclear weapons. Had I said that when I was an Assistant Secretary of State, I probably would have been fired. The statement, like others, was totally unacceptable and has done little to foster stability or reduce the risk of nuclear use. Turning to China, its nuclear forces represent a fundamentally different challenge to the United States. While there is no doubt that China's nuclear capabilities represent a potential threat to the United States and its allies, I'm much less concerned about the evolution of Chinese forces and doctrine than I am with Russia's behavior. Since achieving a nuclear capability in 1964, China has maintained a, quote, no first use policy with regards to its nuclear arsenal. Under that policy, China will not be the first to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances. Available evidence suggests that remains China's policy. Additionally, though China has been actively modernizing its strategic nuclear forces, we have no evidence at this point to suggest that it seeks to move beyond a, quote, minimum deterrent or pursue strategic nuclear parity with the United States or Russia. The primary challenge from China is its attempt to tilt the balance of power in the Western Pacific in its favor through a major conventional force buildup and development of anti-access and area denial and asymmetric capabilities such as anti-satellite weapons and offensive cyber. On that note, both Russia and China are actively developing offensive cyber and anti-satellite capabilities. In testimony before the U.S. Senate Committee on Intelligence in February of this year, the U.S. National Intelligence Director highlighted this concerns. With regards to Russian cyber capabilities, he said, quote, Russia will conduct bolder and more disruptive cyber operations during the next year, most likely using new capabilities against Ukraine. In the next year, Russian intelligence and security services will continue to probe U.S. and allied critical infrastructures. He also echoed similar concerns about China's cyber capabilities. He quoted, quote, China will continue to use cyber espionage and bolster cyber attack capabilities to support national security priorities. China, since 2015, has been advancing in its cyber attack capabilities by integrating its military cyber attack and espionage resources into its new strategic support force, which was established in 2015. And Director Coates also had quite a bit to say about Russia and China's anti-satellite capabilities. And I quote, both Russia and China continue to pursue anti-satellite weapons as a means to reduce U.S. and allied military effectiveness. Now, having discussed the challenge from Russia and China, the question that emerges is how should the United States respond? In this environment, I believe the United States must find a way to effectively address this challenge in a way that deters potential adversaries, maintains strategic stability, and reduces the risk of nuclear use. From my perspective, this requires a comprehensive strategy, which should include the following elements. First, the foundation of that strategy must be to maintain a safe, secure, and effective strategic nuclear deterrent. Therefore, I believe it's imperative that the United States move forward with the modernization of its strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, its nuclear command and control systems, and the Department of Energy supporting infrastructure. Second, the United States must work to maintain and enhance the cohesion of U.S. alliances. In this increasingly competitive international security environment, America's allies are one of its asymmetric advantages. Indeed, the United States' worldwide system of alliances is something that neither Russia nor China possess. Therefore, priority must be given to enhancing these critical political and military networks. Third, the United States must improve the resiliency of its space, cyber, and other critical infrastructure and work with its allies to do the same. As previously noted, Russia and China are dramatically improving their anti-satellite and offensive cyber capabilities to negate perceived U.S. and allied military advantages. In response to this threat, it is imperative that the United States work with its allies and partners to close these gaps in their critical infrastructures to make them less vulnerable to attack. Fourth, the United States should work with Russia to extend the New START Treaty and explore the future role of arms control in managing great power competition. Despite my continuing concerns about Russia's violation of the INF Treaty, I nonetheless believe that the United States and Russia should work together to extend the New START Treaty for an additional 5 years as allowed by the terms of the treaty, primarily for stability reasons. Extending the New START Treaty will also provide the United States and Russia time to think about what the new U.S.-Russia strategic stability framework might look like. Fifth, I also believe, and you've heard this morning, that I'm not uncritical of Russia and China. But at the same time, I think it's imperative that the United States maintain open channels of communication with both countries on nuclear issues, especially in the military-to-military sphere. One of my biggest concerns is that through not talking to one another, we could create a situation where things quickly get out of control. Six, I think the United States should advance a broader global conversation about strategic stability with all relevant actors. While the trilateral U.S.-Russia-China dynamic has tended to dominate the debate on nuclear weapons and strategic stability, other nations, including France, the United Kingdom, India, and Pakistan, have significant strategic capabilities that affect the global strategic balance. Therefore, a mechanism should be established to enable a broader discussion on global strategic stability that brings the major players to the table. One place to begin might be by reinvigorating the quote-unquote P5 process, which was initiated in 2009 to serve as a coordinating mechanism for the P5 members of the United Nations Security Council in the run-up to the 2010 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. This process could also be expanded to include other states like India and Pakistan at the appropriate time. And seventh, and finally, the United States should work with allies and partners to develop norms of behavior for the emerging domains such as space and cyber. While emerging domains like space and cyber are increasingly impacting stability, we lack effective international norms of behavior to help manage competition in these domains. Creating these types of norms for these new domains could help manage competition between great powers and mitigate the risk of strategic miscalculation. Let me conclude my remarks with the following points. We have returned to an era of great power competition in which the United States, Russia, and China are competing for the future of the international order. As part of that competition, Russia and China are not only modernizing their nuclear forces, but they are developing new disruptive capabilities such as offensive cyber and anti-satellite weapons. In this new environment, the United States, working in close coordination with its allies, must find a way to effectively address this challenge in a way that deters potential adversaries, maintains strategic stability, and reduces the risk of nuclear use. I believe that the steps I've outlined above will allow us to do just that. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Maintenant, je passe la parole à Nick Whitney, directeur de recherche au sein de European Council on Foreign Relations, qui l'a rejoint après avoir été directeur général de l'Agence européenne de défense. Donc nous attendons donc d'avoir le point de vue de Nick Whitney sur ces sujets. Gentlemen, you have the floor.
Alors, merci et bonjour à tous. C'est un vrai plaisir de me trouver encore une fois à Paris. Peut-être pour la... Don't worry, this is not long. Peut-être pour la dernière fois sans besoin d'un visa. Okay, Molière can rest comfortable now. I'm going to begin with a confession, which is that I haven't done much thinking about nuclear issues in the last couple of decades. And I think I'm not untypical in that fashion with the British policy community. I mean, there have been things that have happened. We've decided to replace our Vanguard class for Trident nuclear submarines with the Dreadnought class, a decision which justified a half-day debate in the Houses of Parliament. In some ways more significantly, we've signed the Lancaster House treaties, which I do think were a significant and important nuclear evolution, which I will come back to in a while. But generally speaking, I think the feeling has been in London, and not just in London, that nuclear hasn't been a terribly fascinating or dynamic area, and that there have been more important strategic issues with which to engage. I mean, what this does mean is that in my case is that my views on deterrence are largely formed by experience from the last century, from my time in Washington, in the Washington Embassy, when the Euro missile crisis was at its worst. Indeed, we were busy buying Trident from the Americans on that occasion. From my time in the 90s, when I was the Ministry of Defence's, UK Ministry of Defence's Director of Nuclear Policy, and we were putting through some very major reductions in the scale of the British deterrent, and indeed embarking on that bilateral dialogue with Paris, which ultimately led to Lancaster House. And then in the mid-90s, I had the pleasure of spending some months by the sea, by the Pacific Ocean in California at the RAND think tank, where I worked with Olivier Debouzy, whom I expect that many of you will remember and have known and admired, and you will have been as shocked as I by his premature death. But back in that era, freshly emerging from the Cold War, Olivier and I managed to convince each other that the future for both European deterrence was essentially to acquire a European vocation, that the way forward in the 21st century would be for these national deterrents to increasingly offer a form of extended deterrence to European allies and partners. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment, so let me just label that Euro deterrent. Well, I was naturally very interested in, I think last year, when this idea of Euro deterrent broke surface again, and in Berlin, of all unlikely places. I think there was a Bundestag report eventually commissioned which confirmed that Germany could legally and constitutionally pay for somebody else to provide nuclear deterrence. And I don't think it's surprising that this idea should bubble up again, given the deterioration in Europe's strategic environment, which we've covered it extensively today, but the key features are that we now, in Europe, I do feel, face a revanchist Russia, a Russia determined to impose its will on Europe by intimidation and subversion, a Russia which has demonstrated with its free use of chemical weapons that it is not constrained by taboos about the use of weapons of mass destruction. We also have an unusual US president who has gone out of his way to cast doubt upon the collective security guarantee in NATO, has characterized the European Union as a foe. And we do have to ask ourselves, since this is the basis of the US nuclear security guarantee to Europe, would President Trump be willing to risk Chicago to defend Berlin? And I find this a difficult proposition. No wonder then that in consequence of this, there has been a revival of talk about the European defence project, new initiatives for more pooling and collective efforts on defence in Brussels, and a new European global strategy in 2016, which raises the objective, the ambition of strategic autonomy. Well, no one quite knows what strategic autonomy means, but it certainly must have a defence dimension. And it seems, to me at least, pretty clear that there are severe limits to how far Europe can look after itself in defence terms, stand on its own feet, without some form of nuclear underpinning of its conventional capabilities. But before I get overexcited, carried away with the Euro deterrent notion, I do have to acknowledge that before anything like that would happen, two necessary conditions would have to be satisfied. First of all, the two nuclear weapon states would have to make a credible offer of extended deterrence to their European partners. And secondly, the European partners would have to welcome and support that offer. And enthusiast though I may be for the Euro deterrence idea, I have to admit that we're not really there yet on either count. Let me turn to the prospective beneficiaries. I think we know a little bit more about them than we did, owing to a survey which the think tank with which I'm associated, the European Council on Foreign Relations, has recently carried out about attitudes to nuclear weapon issues across Europe. I should acknowledge the help and support we've received in this from the CEA, and we hope to publish it shortly. And as a gross generalization, I think it confirms that I am not alone in having neglected nuclear issues for the last 2 decades. What is perhaps different is that, again, across Europe, there is actually a strong reluctance to re-engage with these issues. Those who finished the Cold War as strong advocates of deterrence are still strong advocates of deterrence. Those who finished the Cold War as unilateral disarmers and abolitionists believe that their positions have been vindicated by events. Nobody really wants to get back into the nuclear debate. Understandable, nuclear weapons are fundamentally distasteful things, but there is abroad a general, frankly, degree of ignorance after 20 years of the subject dropping out of the headline agenda, and a degree of denial as well, just a preference not to talk about these things, to assume that matters can be left as they are. Well, I hope that what I regard actually as the crisis surrounding the INF Treaty has challenged these rather somnolent, soporific attitudes quite severely now. It's certainly shown, I think, that as Europeans we've been very flat-footed, very unused to talking to ourselves about these implications. We've really had to scramble to try to keep up with unilateral moves coming out of Washington. It may be that we will manage collectively, we Europeans, to continue to ignore the issues, but I don't think history will allow us to do so. I don't think we should rightly regard President Trump as an aberration. I think it would be wise at least to recognize the risk that America over the decades to come will, as President Obama said, pivot to Asia, that the confrontation with China and the Western Pacific is going to become an increasing increasing focus of American attention. And if great power competition is back, Europeans are going to have to face up to the thought that either they're going to become the arena for that great power competition, or they're going to have to find a way to become an actor, a special kind of actor in that great power competition where nuclear underpinning may be something they need to think about. Well, that was the demand side, which I suggest doesn't exist at the moment. What about the offer side of European extended deterrence? I am not brave enough to seek to characterize the French position on this, and besides, we've heard a lot about it already today. But one does notice the phrases about France's vital interests and France's borders, and the two not necessarily being congruent or coterminous, which appeared, for example, in the Strategic Review last year, and these are presumably intended to be noticed. As for the Brits, well, how can I sit here talking about British extended deterrence to European allies and partners at just the time when we are pulling out of the European Union and drawing up the drawbridge across the Channel? It's very difficult to know what to say about Brexit just at this moment. I think the first thing to say is don't count on it. We haven't gone yet. You may find you have to put up with us in the future. Maybe wishful thinking, but I rate currently the chances of a second referendum at close to 50-50. I also rate the chances, if we get a second referendum, of Remain winning at something rather better than 50-50. So we haven't gone yet, and I profoundly hope we don't, me and many millions of other Britons. There's also, as one of the sort of bizarre byproducts of the political developments in Britain in the last 2 years, been a strange reawakening to the importance of European security. Theresa May has gone all over Europe affirming that, okay, we're leaving the EU, but we remain fully committed to the security of the European continent. Will that survive the political evolutions of the coming months, the coming weeks? I don't know. But it has been a surprising somersault almost in British views about the importance of security links with the continent. And of course, we Brits have always, ever from the beginning, been rather keen on the idea of extending deterrence. We've always liked to say, oh no, we're spending all this money on the British nuclear deterrent, not really for national purposes. We're doing it because we're good members of the alliance. We're doing it to contribute to the broader NATO deterrence. So extending deterrence is nothing new to the British political psyche. So I say this just to say that fanciful though the idea of a Euro deterrent may be at the moment, inopportune though it may seem to be even talking about it, don't write off the idea. Per contra, I'd like to see Britain and France, as circumstances commit, trying to advance the possibility, in specifically by a deepening of the partnership of Lancaster House. That bilateral treaty already, after all, contains an implicit mutual nuclear security guarantee. And the formula about neither side being able to imagine circumstances in which the vital interests of the one could be threatened without a threat to the vital interests. You know the formula, the code for we have each other's backs in matters of nuclear security. And I believe that we could and should, as two capitals, work towards developing that declaratory policy so that we're transmitting to our European partners and allies the message, we've got each other's backs, and we've got yours too, even if you don't think you want it. And of course, 2010 should not be the end of history as far as what our two nations can do together in the nuclear domain. I would like to see further development take place. I don't see why we shouldn't be collaborating together on issues of nuclear propulsion. I don't see why we shouldn't be broadening our cooperation to matters of nuclear targeting. I know these are shocking ideas, but I think that over time and in a few years, they could be steps that we should be ready to take together. Well, I'm almost through. More generally, I think we just have to do what we can, particularly in Europe, particularly away from France perhaps, to bring nuclear issues back to the fore as a subject on which governments and policy elites must be ready to re-engage. I come back again to the INF crisis. I do think we badly need to receive this as a wake-up call and to catch up with the implications of what is going on here, of how the news of America's determination to abandon the treaty was transmitted to us, and what the implications may be. We've heard some of them described today. For future arms control, will this develop a global dimension which it has not before? There's a host of issues which I freely admit I haven't bottomed out myself. But these are things that the European policy community now needs to grapple with. I therefore felicitate the Council on this conference today and thank you for inviting me.
Merci beaucoup de votre intervention et la parole est maintenant à Monsieur Andrey BAKLITSKYI du Peer Center for International Security, du consultant au Centre PEER, qui est un groupe de réflexion basé à Moscou. Vous avez la parole. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Council for Strategic Training and Research for bringing me here and giving me the floor to provide some Russian perspective from the country, which was mentioned a lot of times today. I would also like to clarify in my bio, you can see that I work at the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry. I'm here in my think tank capacity. I'm not speaking for the government, Diplomatic Academy, or the Foreign Ministry. So in my presentation, I'll try to answer the following questions. What Russia is trying to deter others from, how, what others, mainly the United States, are trying to deter Russia from, and how it's seen from Moscow, what can go wrong, and what can be done about this. To start with what a Russian approach is to the deterrence, you can just look at the Russian military doctrine, the latest one from 2014, which was approved after Crimea, so presumably it's the latest iteration. There are only two conditions under which Russia can use its nuclear weapons in the military doctrine. One is when nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction have been used against Russia, which is quite obvious. And Russia specifically says that it doesn't matter, be it strategic weapons or tactical weapons, both are unacceptable. And the second condition is a conventional attack against Russia when the very existence of state is under threat. While the latter condition is somewhat vague, it's quite intuitive. NATO tanks entering Moscow would be a threat to Russian existence. A plane knocked down at the Turkish border obviously is not a threat to Russian existence. Russia is also trying to prevent wars and military conflicts in general. And here comes the concept of non-nuclear deterrence. It's quite a new concept. It only appeared in 2014, in the latest military doctrine, and is defined as a combination of diplomatic, military, and military technical means aimed at preventing aggression against Russian Federation by non-nuclear means. So this concept is still under development, but it's based on the threat of use of strategic conventional weapons like precision-guided weapons or hypersonic conventional weapons. So how then Russia sees the mechanism of deterrence, how it's planned to deter its adversaries? So mainly it goes between Russia and the United States, of course, and it's based on Russia and the United States having rough parity in strategic nuclear weapons. As Frank has mentioned, strategic treaties are about maintaining this parity, and since both parties are capable of secure second retaliatory strike, then there's no incentive for the first strike. And those relations were based on legally binding bilateral nuclear arms control agreements, which are not doing really well as of lately, and I'll get back to that later. So, as I said, Russia believes that parity with the United States is essential, and Russia is heavily investing in this and is spending a lot of money on it. A number of times today was referred to the March 1st speech by President Putin when he announced 5 new different nuclear systems. But all of those nuclear systems are strategic systems. It's an ICBM, a boost glide vehicle, a hypersonic missile, and 2 quite exotic systems. One is nuclear-powered cruise missile, the other is nuclear-powered autonomous vehicle underwater, also known as nuclear torpedo. So the only reason you have those are for second strike potential. You do not, start an aggression with nuclear torpedo. You do not de-escalate with nuclear torpedo. Those weapons are second strike weapons, and they are presumably strengthening the stability. Russia also maintains that any use of nuclear weapons against it will trigger all-out response. So President Putin, in his latest statement, said that we will respond with full nuclear weapons, even to tactical attack. So everybody should be sure that nuclear weapon cannot be limited with Russia. And there is famous quote that we will go to heaven and they will simply perish. And this is quite consistent with Soviet nuclear strategy. If you read about Soviet nuclear strategy, especially, there is a lot of sources, all sources actually, but there was a good series of interviews taken just after the Cold War concluded in 89-94 by John Hines and his team. So the Soviet strategy up to a certain point was that you would just respond with whatever you have, and you had to transmit that to the United States, and that would be a deterrence. So limited nuclear war was never in Soviet arsenal, partly because any limited nuclear war would be in Europe next to the Soviet Union, so it would target Soviet Union with fallout, but would not impact the United States, so that's a clear disadvantage. But also Soviet Union never had this idea of flexible response. Basically the idea was even, at the very peak of Soviet nuclear thinking about flexibility after 1976, the idea was to organize your nuclear conflict in following periods. There was a period of non-nuclear activities, which would then move to a period of limited nuclear activities, which would move to a period of unlimited nuclear activities, and then there will be a concluding period. So Soviet Union was preparing to fight and maybe win the all-out nuclear war. So when people come up with the idea of escalate to de-escalate doctrine, which presumably is Russia using nuclear weapons first to de-escalate a conflict, this goes against everything the Russian military has been talking for like decades. So currently Russia is aiming at preventing conventional conflicts, but it's also building its military forces to fight those conflicts. And you can see in Syria, in Syrian campaign, you can see in annual exercises which involve big troop numbers, that Russia is actually, ready to fight conventional wars. Well, I'll get later to how this deals with strategic nuclear weapons. So, all in all, this means that Russian conventional forces are prepared to fight limited conventional war. So, I was proceeding with what Russia is apparently being deterred from, and I would get back to Mr. Herrera's statement from this morning. Well, actually, there is no such thing as Gerasimov doctrine. So Gerasimov doctrine is a term invented by a US expert, Mark Galeotti, who earlier this year published a piece, you can look it online, where he apologized and he said, like, I'm sorry, I put this name, which is a catch-all phrase which doesn't explain anything. So in Russia, in some academic circles, we also have theories like control chaos, which explains all of the US attempts to control the world and, have color revolutions in the Middle East and on Russian borders, which is frankly intellectually lazy. It's just, you have this theory which explains whatever happens, which has zero predictive value, and you can just, whatever Russian does, that's Gerasimov doctrine. You're a Russian expert now. So Russia and US didn't really deter each other in 90s and in 2000s. So all of a sudden, when people started paying attention to Russia, they were shocked that Russia, has patrol flights and exercises. Because nuclear powers actually do that. And actually, Russian approaches to nuclear warfighting were much looser in like year 2000 than they've been in 2010, than they've been in 2014, which wouldn't be a surprise for anybody who was following. But when you just woke up in 2014 and say like, hey, what's going on? You would say, oh, Russia's losing, it's nuclear use. It doesn't. So the whole escalate to de-escalate theory, which in a shock to me was included in Nuclear Posture Review, came from an article which was published in 1999 by 3 retired Russian colonels, which said like, a Russian army is in really bad shape. We might lose any conventional war. There have been Kosovo, Yugoslavia thing. What if there's going to be an attack against Russia? What we're going to do? We are not a pair to the United States. And they were proposing that, yes, we might, want to de-escalate with a nuclear weapon. That wasn't an official statement. It never came into Russian military doctrine. And there were talks about this. There are discussions in Russia. There are people who would actually want to have this in military doctrine, but the military doctrine of 2010 and the subsequent military doctrine of 2014 didn't have it. And as I said, the 2014 even had the non-nuclear deterrence, so which is another step before nuclear deterrence. And I just named you the 2 conditions under which you can use nuclear weapons according to the doctrine. So there are people who would say, well, of course, but then the Russian position is disingenuous. They have this military doctrine, but then they have like another military doctrine which no one knows about, but which really has this escalate to de-escalate. So Russian military doctrine, 2010 doctrine, had an annex, which is Foundations of Russian Policy on Nuclear Deterrence. It's secret, it's classified. Again, every military doctrine has a classified part. So I've been talking to people with different people who've seen this document and said, no, it's pretty much the same. It's consistent with the military doctrine. So nothing there. And also, if you look to, I guess the exercises were mentioned today, but if you actually look at the exercises, and there was a great work made by your colleague, Bruno Tetre from Fondation pour une Recherche Stratégique, who actually looked into exercises. And like in 2000s, there is 0 nuclear element in Russian exercises. There are ICBM tests, but they are not including in any part in conventional capabilities. So frankly, it's a surprise. It made it to nuclear posture review, and it's a surprise that if you actually read the research on Russian escalate to de-escalate doctrine, either the majority of sources are in English, so people didn't look into Russian, texts, or they just, interpreting them really wrong, or maybe they don't know Russian or whatever. So I really would put it here. If you want, you can go online. I have an article co-authored with Ole Olikar from CSIS on this subject, and there are many other debunking this whole concept, but it still unfortunately comes up. I really enjoyed your comment on Russian, rhetoric, which is, bad, and that anybody would be fired after such words. I mean, Russians and Americans can exchange like this for a long, long time, and I'm not going there. But, fire and fury after those tweets and comments by President Trump, like anything compared to that is very restrained. So, I mean, Russia is actually has a lot of concerns of its own, which has been putting to U.S. to the West for a long time, and it's actually not getting any responses, or at least any responses would have any merit in them. So I'll be moving to the maybe some conclusions and recommendations, and I'll be glad to answer any of the questions. The biggest problem we have now is that arms control, as you know, it is falling apart, and that's a fact, I guess. So there are a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons for that, which is not, it shouldn't be there, I guess, is that U.S. doesn't seem it's interested in arms control anymore. U.S. left the ABM treaty because it felt it didn't need it, and it didn't care about Russian reaction, and that's almost a quote, which U.S. official told Russia that do whatever you want, please. U.S. is planning to leave the INF treaty, and let's be frank, it's not about alleged Russian violation, and even if you believe that there was a Russian violation, then it's mainly because U.S. doesn't seem interested in this treaty. Why now? Why at this point? If, U.S. claims that Russia has violated 5 years ago, why this specific moment? Then both President Trump and National Security Advisor Bolton were quite clear. This is about Russia and China, and Chinese compliance is one of the conditions. So whatever Russia does or doesn't, that's not really changing the narrative in Washington. And actually, the treaty, even in this form, even if you believe that Russia is violating it to a certain extent, it's still constraining Russia. So if you read those reports or newspaper articles or the leaks, because we don't actually have any information, we have to trust US government or not trust US government, but if you look at this, it talks about a couple of dozens of 9M79 ground-launched cruise missiles. Those are not military significant. And I'm quoting here US Deputy Chief of Staff. They're not military significant. They're not changing anything in Europe. They are dwarfed by US sea-launched cruise missiles, by US air-launched cruise missiles. They're dwarfed by Russian sea-launched cruise missiles and air-launched cruise missiles. This is not, something crazy happening which will lead us to Armageddon. So this is a choice of US. They are just deciding they are leaving this treaty, and there will be no this constraint on Russia, which currently exists. So this 2 months postponement is, in my view, a window dressing. There were no substantive discussions with Russia on how to solve the INF issue in 2 years when Donald Trump was president. I don't see a reason to believe that it will change in 2 months. And the next thing is a new start. US administration didn't like it from the beginning, and now there is additional pressure from Republicans in Congress, and we've seen those letters from the senators to Donald Trump saying we don't need to extend it, we don't need it, we should build a better, stronger nuclear force, we are better, why should we constrain ourselves? So also ratification of any new strategic arms treaty doesn't seem likely if New START goes. I can't really see US Congress currently ratifying anything with Russia. So maybe some thoughts on what we can do. I'll start with the New START. The problem with losing New START is not only about the numbers. Numbers are important. We don't really want an arms race. But, I mean, it's not a given fact that there'll be all-out nuclear arms race. But the problem is that confidence-building measure goes. And New START is a very elaborate treaty, and there is a series of notifications and inspections, and notifications are very, very precise. So we exchange information on our missile launches, on telemetry from those launches. We exchange information of our naval patrols, of our bomber flights, of our exercises. We make sure that there's no provocations in those things when they happen. So I've been talking to people who were in strategic missile forces during the Soviet times, and then saying like, you wouldn't believe, every time there was a huge NATO exercise, we, the launch officers, we would sit in the control rooms waiting for launch order. We didn't know what the exercise was about. Was it preparation for, bolt from the blue? We didn't know. We just went there and hoped there will be no launch order coming. So I would like to have those preserved. If not a treaty, an executive agreement, maybe something political binding. But losing this would be a huge detrimental to everybody, and I don't see a reason why we should, shoot ourselves in the leg. So presumably the INF will be gone in a couple of months. If you take the full cycle later next year, then the question of deployment starts. So this is something that I guess European Union can discuss, or Europeans can discuss with Russia. If there is no deployment of US ground-launched cruise missiles and, God forbid, intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe, which would be, again, a total nightmare, and we are back in the 80s. So if there is no deployment, then maybe there is a possibility of, Russia not going full swing and producing those missiles as well. Again, I'm speaking for myself. I'm not sure what's the Russian position would be if US withdraws, but that's something which we can at least think about. And again, I'm not sure what's the value of missile defense in Europe. Again, I've been not understanding this for a long time. I still don't understand. If EU and NATO are so obsessed with Russian threat, you can better use this money for addressing real problems NATO has with logistics, strengthening NATO military, build new airfields in the Baltics. If it's your problem is with Russia, you defend from Russia, apparently not building missile defense from Iranian threat, which doesn't exist and which Europe is currently cooperating to save the JCPOA. So, all in all, that's Russian point of view, and thank you for the attention.
Bon, nous avons quelques minutes pour des questions avant la prochaine table ronde qui est à 45, qui est à 15h45. Alors, est-ce que les participants ont des questions à poser aux panélistes? The floor is yours.
Laurent Gerbert, this is a question for Dr. Rose. You said at the beginning that you would be talking about an American position and not a Trump's administration position. Could you elaborate on the difference you're making between the two positions?
Well, does this work? Can you hear me? I wasn't necessarily speaking for the Trump administration, but I wanted to give a broad view. And I think what I had to say about this concern about the return of great power competition, that's pretty much shared across the political spectrum in the United States, number one. Number two, concerns about Russia and their compliance with arms control is pretty much shared across the political spectrum. I was a senior appointee in the Obama administration, and I spent a lot of my time trying to bring the Russians back into compliance. And I also believe that the Trump administration spent a lot of time trying to bring the Russians back into compliance. I think one of the things I get concerned about is that when they read the press, they think just because Donald Trump says something, it doesn't have much reticence across the political spectrum. That's true for some issues, but I think on many of the issues that I talked about in my presentation, there's a good deal of bipartisan support. So that, I was trying to make a joke. Obviously, I'm not that funny. I got that. But I just wanted you to understand is the concerns, especially about the Russians in INF, that is across the political spectrum. And quite frankly, with regards to Russia, I would make an argument that in many ways, the Democratic Party is now more radical than the Republican Party.
D'autres questions? Merci. Another question? Ici.
Спасибо, господин Андрей Баклитский, ваш доклад. I will turn to English. Can you give us some figures? What is the percentage of the budget devoted to the atomic weapons, to Russia, and the proportion between the modernization of the atomic section and the non-atomic, the relation between civil defense or civil industry and military industry, and in case of a new arm race, it's not clear. Trump say we're going to exhaust you, as we exhausted you in the late 80s, and sometimes he said we want to avoid that. How far the budget, the Russian budget, according to my knowledge, was 65 to now 54 billion, when the American 709. Though how the Russian economy as it is now, with 2% growth, with the price of oil hovering from 6 to 80, how can Russians sustain a mid-range competition in all the fields of strategy, atomic, with the United States, with China who is growing up? I'm not saying China is a long-term competitor. How you see that? And especially, I put the question, I've never the answer. What are the relations between all the military complex and the civil industry? Your civil atomic industry is very strong. Do you have relation with the two? Because you take the best engineer is the military field. I have testimony, young people are attracted to that. How do you see that?
Okay, thank you. Is this on? Yeah, apparently. Thank you very much for your question. So, frankly, I don't want to see us having an arms race. We, as you said, we have a lot of problems in Russia. We have economy which is growing despite the sanctions. It's not the best shape, but it's growing. It's not collapsing anytime soon. And we can use those revenues for, building infrastructure, which we lack, for, building new schools and hospitals. So, and I guess that's a sentiment that is shared across the Russian government, and we've been hearing it from President Putin, from our ministers, that we don't want to have an arms race. So, presumably, if there is one, it will try to do something asymmetric, like underwater torpedoes, which would be as crazy as everybody would just leave Russia alone. But there are several issues. First of all, it's the parity of purchasing power. So Russia is buying its missiles with rubles, not with dollars. And the labor costs and other things are cheaper in Russia, so it doesn't necessarily reflect directly those things. The second thing is that, frankly, Russia would tolerate more spending on defense than the West would. If the US grows its debt even further, at a certain point, next administration would say, let's have an arms control treaty, as they actually had in the 70s when everybody was against new, missiles, and then how detente actually happened because Democrats said we were not voting for your defense budgets. So that's one thing. About civilian and military. So basically, yes, Rosatom, which is Russian nuclear corporation, has a military division which produces the warheads. So there is a synergy there. And you are right, there is a talent moving in between those things. And yes, Russian peaceful nuclear energy industry is a strong one, and it actually has a lot of cooperation with French here, including providing the enrichment services for the French nuclear power plants. And that's another fear, that Rosatom currently is not under any sanctions, but they could get there, and that would be a problem for all the countries where they are building, including Finland, including Hungary, and if it's sanctioned by US and you got these huge problems for working with them, that would be a problem for everybody.
Merci. Une toute dernière question et ensuite on passera à la table ronde.
Merci, Jacques Bordet. My question is about the shield, the balance between the shield and the sword. In 87 in Helsinki, the negotiation full of hope failed because of that point. What is the status of the thinking in your countries and of the discussions between your countries on the balance between the shield and the sword and the anti-missiles?
Oops, everything's fallen to pieces. Kind of a good metaphor for the arms control regime. Everything's fallen to pieces. Listen, to a certain extent, we don't know exactly where the Trump administration is on missile defense because they have yet to release their missile defense review. So I really can't say where they are. What I will say, if you look at the history since the end of the Cold War under President Clinton, President George W. Bush, and President Obama, our missile defenses were very, very specifically designed to deal with threats from states like North Korea and Iran. They were not designed, nor do they have the technical capability to undermine Russia or China's strategic deterrent. And the consistent view with regards to Russia and China is that, one, we would engage them in discussions, but ultimately we would use nuclear deterrence to deter Russia and China. Again, I don't know where the Trump administration will come out in their missile defense review, but my gut tells me, for a variety of reasons, that they will probably say something along those lines, that missile defenses are not directed against Russia and China's strategic deterrent. Now, I wrote an article a couple of months ago on this upcoming missile defense review. I think two issues that people should watch in the missile defense review will be as follows. One, how does the missile defense review talk about Russia and China's short and medium range capabilities? Are we specifically going to begin, we the United States, structuring our missile defenses to deal with that Russian short and medium range threat? So that's question number one. And then question number 2 is, will the Missile Defense Review recommend the United States begin developing space-based missile defense interceptors? Now, you've probably seen the press reporting that you have a number of senior defense officials in this administration who have talked about the need for space-based capabilities. The last 3 prior administrations decided not to go that way for a variety of technical but also strategic stability reasons. I assume that if the United States does announce a decision in the Missile Defense Review to begin pursuing space-based missile defense interceptors, that will likely engender a response from Russia and China.
Merci. Bon, ça conclut la... Yes, yes.
If I may just... Yeah, it's on. So I would agree with much of what Frank said. I would just add one thing which you also would like to look into the Missile Defense Review is if hypersonic missiles would be specifically named and if there is a need to create any kind of defense against them, because currently only Russia and China have programs which are in development, or in Russian case, which are fielded. So if there is hypersonic missile defense, that would be a defense against Russia and China, whatever you say, because others don't have it, Iran doesn't have it. The current state of missile defense, yeah, I would agree that current missile defense, current anti-missiles cannot hit down Russian strategic forces. The problem is that you can always upgrade them, and those positions which are currently in Poland and in Romania, they are the Mk-41 launchers, which is basically a tube in the ground, which you can put anything in. And once you decide to create new anti-missiles, you do that, but you already have the infrastructure in place. And the United States were never agreeing to limiting the speed of its interceptors like to any number, because they were saying like, look, we don't know what would be the future, we won't tie our hands. So there's no guarantees, and that's main problem which Russia has with this.
Can I just come back real quickly on Aegis Ashore? I have a special place in my heart for the Aegis Ashore sites because I was the lead negotiator for both sites in Romania and Poland. And I just want to come back to a point Andrey raised about, well, this could be used to launch a cruise missile. 3 points. One, the sites in Poland and Romania don't have the hardware or the software to launch a Tomahawk cruise missile. Number 2, if you look at the legal agreements that the United States negotiated with Romania and Poland, those agreements, which are online, specifically prohibit the deployment of anything beyond anything besides non-nuclear missile defense interceptors. Number 3, if we really wanted to deploy cruise missiles in Europe, we wouldn't put them in fixed sites. We'd do what the Russians are doing with the SSC-8. We'd make them mobile.
Yes, Nick?
Very briefly, on the ABM in Europe thing, I actually have a bit of sympathy with Andrey over this. I've never really been able to understand what the graduated NATO program for installing missile defenses has been about. The idea that it was directed against rogue states seemed pretty otiose, particularly as most of the rogue states, Iraq, Libya, we'd hoped Iran, had all been taken off the map. It seemed to me that it was a rather typical example of what's happened in the last 2 decades of Europeans not troubling to think about things too hard, doing what they were told in NATO, and is a good example of my contention that Europeans should re-engage with strategic and nuclear missile defense issues and think harder about what their interests are rather than simply following a lead from elsewhere. I would just say that I wouldn't take the idea of European collective consideration as far as taking up Andrey's kind offer that we should, as Europeans, now go and talk to Russia about the implications of the disappearance of the INF Treaty. I think that that sounds to me like what we used to call decoupling.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your contributions.